You know how some people collect fridge magnets from their travels? Well, Dan Brotman collects passports and visas, and maybe even a few near-death experiences. At 38, he's lived in 5 countries, holds almost enough passports to start his own Olympic team, and he's about to tick off his 100th country, which is 99 more than many of people could actually point to on a map. So he's been to a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, to war-torn Ukraine, to Russia, and he travels to places that your mom tells you specifically not to go to. He's not your average travel influencer. There's no hashtag blessed Bali beach selfie. And today, Dan Brotman joins me on Imagine If I Was Sensitive. We're going to get into what drives him, what he's found, and why some people look for trouble, like Dan. Dan, you're heading to your 100th country. At what number does it stop being impressive and start being a cry for help?
So I always wanted to reach 100 countries. I actually wanted to reach 100 countries before the age of 40, and I'm doing it by the age of 38. But then, there is such a thing as country tickers. So it's a whole genre of travelers who want to do all 197 UN recognized countries. I'm not a country ticker. So I think for me, after 100, I want to just visit countries that interest me. And it can be returning to countries I've been to or new countries.
Okay, so what draws you to these countries, these non-touristy destinations?
Well, I would probably say it started when I was 14 and I moved to South Africa. I mean, South Africa is a country internationally that's known as quite complex,
Mm-hmm.
quite dangerous. But I was drawn to it because of its complexity. So when I was in primary school, I used to go to the library and they had different books about South Africa, and I got very drawn into these books. And when I was 14, I begged my dad to take us on holiday to Cape Town. We went. There was a local school there. We met the principal, and the principal said, if you want to come to my school for 1 year, you're more than welcome to. And my parents actually agreed and said I could. So at the age of 14, by myself, I went to live in South Africa for a year with a local family. Again, it was a much more dangerous environment, a much more complex and colorful environment than where I grew up. But I would say that's probably when it started.
How did your parents deal with that? I mean, then your desire to leave home could have been a little offensive to them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very appreciative that they allowed me to be an adventurer from such a young age. They
Mm.
always taught us to be quite independent. But I would say that that year in South Africa really changed me. It changed me living in such a different culture, living with a family from that culture, going to school in that culture. And it was really from that moment on that I never felt fully at home in the US again. So after
Right.
the year in Cape Town, I did move back to the US. I did finish high school there, but I always kind of felt like a visitor. South Africa really changed me, and I never would have guessed that years later I'd be returning and would live there for over a decade and would even officially become South African. But I would say South Africa is really where it all began.
Fascinating. I mean, you traveled to Ukraine, you've traveled to Russia. How do you pack for a war zone?
I would say that for most destinations, I don't factor in whether it's a war zone or not. I kind of look at, factors like what are the activities I want to do there? Am I going to be doing outdoorsy activities? Am I
Mm.
going to be in a city, in an urban area? What's the weather like? So I think it's more around weather and activities. But I mean, certainly because I define myself as a citizen journalist, so I definitely pack all the equipment I need to be able to film, and also, of course, a journal because I write, and then I publish.
So if there was a country out of all of the countries you visited that surprised you most, which one would it be?
Probably say Iran.
Right.
I would probably say Iran, and just going back to sort of how the teen I became a South African citizen. It was a very, very long process.
Right.
And actually, funnily enough, the EFF fought for my citizenship and took it to Parliament. It's a very funny story. But I became a South African citizen, and the first thing I asked myself is, where can I travel now I couldn't before? When people think of South African passport, they often think it's very restrictive. But in fact, being American and Israeli, that's also restrictive geopolitically. So I said, now that I have a neutral passport, where can I go? So I went online. I found a tour in North Korea.
So you were in North Korea, and you decide that from there it's got to be Iran.
Yes, I decided that Iran would be the next place. I mean, Iran, of course, is viewed as, the enemy by both of my countries, by the US, of course, since the Islamic Revolution, by Israel. I mean, it's really the forbidden fruit for both of my identities. And South Africans all got a visa on arrival. So I signed up for a tour to Iran. And I mean, there were so many things that were surprising for me about Iran. I mean, for starters, the population is not religious. It's actually a very, very secular population. And they're the biggest enemies of their government. They have religious coercion impacting every aspect of their life. So they basically live their private lives behind closed doors. They drink. They don't hate Israel at all. That was very surprising, asking people their thoughts on Israel. I remember we were actually at the former US Embassy, which is now a museum. It's called the Den of Espionage. And the tour guide at the museum in the open said, I love Donald Trump because Donald Trump is against my government and I'm against my government. And this is back in 2019. So I would say that Iran, the fact that people were so openly against their government, so secular, didn't have negative feelings towards Israel, were pro-Trump. And then on top of it, I got to spend quite a bit of time with the Jewish community in Iran, which was also very surprising because when I tell people that, they say, I don't even know that there were Jews still living there. So Iran was probably one of the most eye-opening trips that I've ever had. And I reported quite a bit on my experiences in Iran. And not only that, I brought two Jews from Iran to South Africa on a speaking tour following that trip to speak about what it's like to be Jewish in Iran today.
What's so amazing is the similarities between South Africa and Iran in the sense that you have this vast amount of people that know that their government doesn't represent them. It's really, really so interesting to hear. Now you wonder a little bit more why the ANC is so drawn to the Iranian regime. I didn't think of that similarity.
It's a very good point. That's a very good point. But I mean, I think that as I got older and as I traveled more, and obviously the media landscape has changed, I have become more and more skeptical of mainstream media. And when I turn on mainstream media outlets, I'm automatically thinking, okay, what's their agenda, or what are they not including in this story? So for me, what I really set out to do was to travel to the places that I thought were misunderstood in the world and to try to look for the other parts of the story that the mainstream media wasn't telling. So kind of for me, the way that I would choose many destinations is I would like turn on the news, where are they reporting on? And then I'd say, okay, I'm going to go there myself and let's see what I uncover.
Was it an additional concern for you that you're gay?
No, I would not say that no, because again, that goes back to the media. There's complexity in all of these countries and how they deal with all types of issues, including gay people.
Right.
So, for example, when I was in Iran, I met gay people, and I found out that in Iran, they don't just execute anyone who they suspect of being gay. It has to be 3 policemen catch you in the act.
Oh gosh.
So
Okay.
it's so rare that something like that would happen. I met gay couples there. And again, I think that in many of them,
Yeah, because my perception is if you're gay, you just make sure that nobody knows to some extent, to a great extent.
Yeah, I mean, I that's what I thought too. And I went there, and again, obviously, it's a terrible place to be gay.
Oh,
But you
sure.
go to these places and you learn how people live semi-normal lives despite the circumstances that they are surrounded
Mm,
that they're surrounded with. I mean, when I was in Ukraine, I met people who hadn't left their flats in years because they were afraid of being arrested on the street, or not arrested, of being conscripted, conscription
wow.
on the
Wow.
street, and they hadn't left their flats in years. And these are young people whose lives were wasting away. And these are the types of stories that we don't talk about when we discuss the war between Russia and Ukraine and what this is doing to Ukraine as a nation. So yeah, so to answer your question, I mean, I'm always discreet about my identity everywhere I
Sure.
go. So
Right.
I'm discreet about American in some places, discreet about Israeli, discreet about Jewish, discreet about gay. But in many of these countries, even for heterosexual people, men and women don't hold hands in the street, don't
Right.
kiss in the street. Your private life is very much your private life indoors, regardless of your sexual orientation.
You've spent a lot of time, though, given that that said about hiding your identity, not hiding your identity, but not openly showing your identity in terms of Judaism. You've spent a lot of time looking for and finding the maybe remnants of Jewish community, historical aspects of various Jewish communities around the world. I know that I read, is it Friedman's a book on Syria where he goes through the Aleppo Codex, and it just opened up this window into something so fascinating. You must do this all the time.
Yeah, well, so I see myself as a bridge between diaspora Jews and their roots. So for many Jews in the diaspora, they actually don't return to where their ancestors came from, either because it's too dangerous or maybe they don't have a desire,
Hmm.
but there still is a lingering curiosity. So, for me, when I go to countries in the former Soviet Union or countries in the majority Muslim world that were emptied out of Jews within your lifetime, I go and speak to the descendants, to groups of the descendants of these communities, and I talk to them about what infrastructure still exists from when their ancestors lived there. But I also tell them about the Jews who still live there, because in every community, I mean, you can even look not too far from where you are in Zimbabwe, there still are Jews, even in small numbers, who, despite all the circumstances, choose to stay. So in 1992, remaining 4,000 odd Jews in Syria were allowed to leave, and almost sort of, I don't want to say overnight, but very, very quickly, within the span of a year, a community that was thousands of years old emptied out completely. However, there were 100 Jews who stayed behind in Syria. And what happened to these 100 Jews? And so those are the kinds of stories that I try to uncover when I visit these countries. What happened to that very small group of remaining Jews? How did they maintain a semblance of Jewish life? How did they maintain a semblance of normalcy in a very abnormal situation?
I saw a clip of yours about Syria. Take us through that experience, what it was like to go to a place that, as you've said, has emptied itself out of Jews, but in fact has such a rich, phenomenal Jewish history.
So Syria, I mean, one of the things that surprised me the most about Syria was really how diverse it is. I mean, Syria has a very significant Christian community, Armenian community, Druze. I mean, we're reading about it now in the news with the massacres of minorities. But when I went to Syria, so I was part of the largest tour group to return to Syria post-revolution. I was supposed to go to Syria several years ago, and both times I was meant to go, the trip was called off for various reasons. So I really wanted to go. It was one of the last countries in the Arab world that I hadn't visited. And so there was this opportunity when the regime fell to visit Syria as a Western tour group, and I signed up for the trip. Um, I had a curiosity about, my understanding is there are a few Jews left in Syria. How have they experienced the revolution? What were the Assad years like? What is their day-to-day existence like? So on the first day of our tour, I was with, of course, with a non-Jewish group.
Mm.
I asked our local tour guide, "Can you please take us to the old Jewish quarter?" So that was the area of Damascus where up until 1992 the Jewish community lived. And we went to the Jewish quarter. I was in touch with a young guy in New York who was born in Syria, Jewish guy born in Syria, left when he was a baby. He gave me the name of a Jewish guy who still lives in Damascus. And so when we were in the old Jewish quarter, I was going up to people saying, do you know this man? Do you know this man? And everyone said, no, we've never heard of this guy. It turned out that he gave me his Jewish name and not the
Oh.
name that the Muslims know
Mm.
him by. So no one had heard of this name. And I was looking for remnants of like mezuzot or any kind of sign that this was a Jewish quarter, even within my lifetime. And there was absolutely no sign. You would never guess. And I just about gave up. And then the following day, we had a couple of free hours where we could roam around on our own. And I said, you know what? I'm going to go try one last time without the group. And so I went back by myself, and I don't speak Arabic, and somehow I was able to communicate. I knocked on the door of a man's house and I said, I'm Jewish. I'm looking for another Jewish person who lives in this area. Is there someone? And he said, aha, I know someone. I will take you to his house. So we walked down the street. He knocked on the door, and the man was home, and he welcomed me into his home. And his name is Bahor Siman Tov. That's his Jewish name.
Right.
Right.
The name that he's known by in Syria is Eid, and that was why no one knew when I said Bahor. So we went into his home. He was with his friend Mazen, who is a Muslim Syrian, and I spent a few hours with them smoking nargila, drinking tea, finding out a lot of information about why he stayed in Syria, who's still in Syria. So it turns out that as I said, in 1992, there were 100 Jews who elected to stay in Syria. This year, 2025, at the beginning of the year, there were 9 Jews left in Syria.
Wow.
9.
Wow.
3 of them passed away this year already because they were so old. So from January until April, and during a 4-month span, 3 Jews died. They went from 9 to 6. Of the 6 Jews who were still in Syria, Bahor and his 2 sisters are 3 of them, so they're half. His 2 sisters married non-Jews. One married a Muslim, one married a Christian. Their other siblings moved to Israel, the US, and Mexico. And then there are 3 Jews still in Syria who are not part of their family. I asked him, why did you stay? You could have left when everyone else left. And he said, Damascus is in my soul. He had a great social life. He's one of the most famous tailors in Syria. And he also said that because he's a bachelor and because he never had kids, he decided to stay. But if he had children,
Then he would have left. Yeah.
Yeah.
and then fascinating. A week later, we were traveling all over Syria, came back into Damascus, and he took me to the Jewish cemetery in Damascus, which even, I don't know if you're familiar with Itai Engel, is a very famous Israeli journalist who reports from the Arab world, and he did a very big special on Syria and even interviewed this man post-revolution. Even Itai Engel hadn't been to the Jewish cemetery in Damascus, and that was really fascinating for me because, first of all, I was seeing graves from this year that were being written in Hebrew and in Arabic. I was looking at graves from the 80s, from the 90s, from the 2000s. So it really shows that there was something still in Syria, some type of Jewish community. But what was very sad is the last rabbi left in 1992. So from that moment on, Bahor decided to become a vegetarian because there was no more kosher slaughter in the country.
Wow.
So he's a vegetarian, but when they bury bodies now, they send the bodies to the Muslims to be cleansed, to be purified, and then they basically just dig a hole in the Jewish cemetery, put the body in, cover it, and that's it. There's no Jewish ceremony. So it was very sad for me seeing like the infrastructure that they once had that's really crumbling, and you have such a wealthy Syrian Jewish diaspora all over the world, and the cemetery where their ancestors are buried is really, really in a terrible state. And so I wanted to draw attention to this cemetery and why it should be preserved by the Syrian Jewish diaspora. And also to remind people that cemeteries tell a story of a community everywhere you go. So when I was in Beirut, Lebanon, I trespassed, I broke into the Jewish cemetery. What was the first thing I looked for in the Jewish cemetery? What are the newest graves? Why was I looking for the newest graves? Because the newest graves tell you whether there's still a Jewish community in that country. So I spend time in. Of course, my priority is always to meet living Jews,
Yeah.
but I also prioritize going to the cemetery because what's written on the gravestones and the dates on the
Gives you
gravestones
such a
tells you that even if the
phenomenon.
community's in hiding, there still is a community. And when you see a gravestone in 2000 from 2018 in Beirut, Lebanon,
Wow.
it makes you ask, it makes you wonder. Who's presiding over the funeral? Who's etching the gravestone in Hebrew? Um, who's purifying the body? It elicits
So
all types
interesting.
of interesting questions.
Yeah, because it gets to the fundamental of what community is. Let's talk about Beirut because you didn't have such a positive experience there. What happened?
Well, I've had very positive experiences in Beirut. So I've been to Lebanon 4 times.
Okay.
The first time was in 2021 was my first time. So it was during COVID, and I was itching to travel. I mean, we all were. And there was a tour company that I had traveled with previously, and this was they announced that their first tour that they were restarting post COVID was to Lebanon. And I was very nervous about going to Lebanon because I have Israeli citizenship, but I decided to do it anyways and signed up. I had the most incredible time. I was in Lebanon 1 year after the port blast, which was a national trauma for the
Oh,
Lebanese.
yes, of course.
That was when they had, I believe it was manure or some type of very
Fertilizer.
flammable
It was a
substance.
fertilizer.
Fertilizer, exactly, at the port, and it exploded. Hundreds of people were killed, thousands were maimed. Lebanon didn't have a government. The government resigned. They didn't have a government. There was no functioning government. They had been through a national trauma. There was no petrol, virtually very little petrol in the country. People would queue up for petrol 16 hours a day sometimes. I mean, the country was really, if you think of a crumbling country. So I went to Lebanon. I had a fascinating experience. Every conversation I had in Lebanon was how can help us leave Lebanon. People were desperate to leave. I spent time with the minority Armenian population in Lebanon, which is really fascinating. I then wound up returning to Lebanon the following year. Uh, that was not on an organized tour. That was just on my own to learn more about Lebanon. I loved the country so much. I mean, it was the most similar to Israel. I mean, it almost felt like Tel Aviv, but like a little off.
Off,
But it
right.
felt but it felt very similar to Israel. I went back in 2022. Also incredible experience. That's where I was spent time with the Jewish cemetery. And then basically the third and fourth times to Lebanon, because of my trip to Syria. So
Right.
our tour began in Beirut. The group met in Beirut, and then we drove like less than 2 hours to the Syrian border. Damascus is very close to the border. So I landed in Lebanon. Everything was fine, smooth as usual. I wasn't worried. I slept in a hotel in Beirut, met the group the next day. We left. We went to Syria, did the Syria trip. We then crossed back into Lebanon after the Syria trip because most of us had to catch flights home,
From there.
just going through the Beirut airport. And I handed my American passport to the border official, and he scans it, and then he's taking too long. He's staring at the screen and he's taking too long. And I'm wondering, like, why isn't he asking me, like, how long are you going to be in Lebanon for? Like, all the typical questions he was asking everyone else in my group. He wasn't asking me anything. He then stands up and says, holds my passport and says, "Follow me." And I think to myself, oh boy, is this the moment when I've been discovered? And you've got to remember that I've done crazy, crazy stuff, and I've been to almost the entire Arab world and other, not so safe Muslim countries, always undetected.
Right.
Right.
Um, but I didn't panic, so I really focused on staying calm. They took me to a back room, and at first they were like, "Yeah, it's just a name issue, name mix up. Don't worry about it. We should be out in a few minutes. We just need to go speak to Beirut." So they went to another room, spoke to Beirut. They came back and then they said, Daniel, have you served in the Israel? Did you serve in the Israeli army? And when they asked me
Mm, mm,
that, I
mm.
couldn't lie because if they were asking me that,
Yeah,
they
they
knew.
already
already
know.
know.
Mm.
Yeah. So, and again, for me, my main focus was staying calm. And so I said, I explained that I had moved to Israel when I was 18. I was in the army and I don't
Mm.
live in Israel anymore. Um, and long story short, they went back to speak to Beirut. They came back and they said, it was a few of them came and they said, we are suspending you. And I didn't know what suspending meant. Did it mean arrest? Did it mean detain? They took my watch, they took my cell phone, and I was actually like deleting apps while I was waiting. After the Israeli army question, I was deleting apps. I was deleting
Mm.
Instagram. Yeah, I didn't know what was going to happen. And so then they lead me away. I've been, stripped of my devices to a dark holding cell down the corridor. No natural light, no water, and I'm just sitting in the cell not knowing what's going to happen. And then the latch opens and it's our tour leader because remember I was at the
Mm.
border with my
Mm.
entire
Mm.
group. And the tour leader says, Dan, they're transferring you to a facility in Beirut.
Oh my
Oh,
God.
We are taking your bags with us now to Beirut with the group. She actually was afraid that maybe I had something incriminating in my bag. And so she wanted to get it, which I
Mm.
didn't, but she
Mm.
wanted to get it
Mm.
out of the border as soon as possible. Um, and we are going to be in touch. I'm going to contact the U.S. Embassy and your family. And then a guard started shouting, and pointing at me, Israeli soldier, Israeli soldier. And I just shot her this look of terror. And then the latch slammed shut.
Mm.
And from that moment on, I was completely on my own. It turns out that the group was forced to leave the border. They made every person in the group write down their mother's name. I suspect they were seeing if anyone had a
Mm.
Jewish mother.
Mm.
mm,
They were suspicious that there might be another Israeli in the group. There was no other Jew in the group. It was only
Mm.
me.
Mm.
And then they left the border. So I was completely on my own. I was brought back. I was basically forced to sign a statement. Which I got them at least to do Google Translate with the camera so I could
Right.
read what I was signing. It was accurate. I was then handcuffed. I was taken to Zahle, which is a city about 30 minutes away, to a different facility. I was held there for many, many hours, and again in a really filthy kind of dark cell. A guard came and said, "The U.S. Embassy is already taking care of it. You're going home tonight. All is going to be fine." I mean, they kept on telling me that it was all taken care of and everything was going to be fine. I learned from day one that they lie, and you could never trust anything that they said. They just make stuff up. And then a few hours later, I was handcuffed again, put into a prisoner transport vehicle, and taken to the equivalent of the CIA headquarters in Beirut. It's called General
This
Security.
is
is
beyond
beyond.
Um,
words.
I remember, I mean, it was speeding to Beirut. Bottles were flying everywhere. There was no seat belt. I was handcuffed. It backed into the building, and then men came with machine guns and led me upstairs. I had to give the codes to my phone again. I was photographed. I was then put back into the prisoner transport vehicle and taken to a prison. I was put in a cell, no blanket, no water, no food, um, no toilet. The following morning, I was crammed into a prisoner transport vehicle with mostly Syrians. And when I say crammed, I mean really like crammed, like you cannot sit down. And handcuffed and crammed into a prisoner transport vehicle, brought back to the General Security headquarters. And that's when I met my interrogator for the first time. And I wound up basically being with him almost every day of my detention. Went through probably 8-hour interrogations every day. Um, it was a horrible, horrible experience. Very invasive. I mean, they spent 6 days going through my phone. My phone was at a different
Mm.
Mm,
Mm.
government department. Like really, every message, every photograph. Every aspect of my life was dissected. Eventually, the U.S. Embassy. showed up and the whole time I was there, I said, I want to speak to the US embassy. I want to speak to the US embassy. And they would always say, yeah, tonight, tonight, tonight. And then it would never happen.
Wow.
Finally, on day three, the US embassy came, the consul came, with an assistant. And I remember it was the first, I was sleeping in handcuffs. I was handcuffed for days. And it was the first time my handcuffs were really taken off. First time my handcuffs were taken off, or when I went to go meet the U.S. embassy. And I remember he said to me, "Mr. Brotman, how are you doing?" And I said, "I've been better." The Lebanese were in the room, and my understanding is that by day three, the White House had already knew about my detention.
So this is the first time that you've now been taken off handcuffs. The American consulate is there. You find out that the White House by day three is aware of you being taken, being arrested. What happens next?
Well, actually, so this is this is the one thing is that I arrested?
Well, as I was asking you the question, I'm thinking, were you arrested? Were you detained? Were you, I don't want to say taken hostage because it sounds a bit Greta Thunberg, but this was a pretty serious situation.
Well, I mean that's what was so unusual about the situation
Mm,
was there was not an arrest warrant for me that I saw. I wasn't given even the option of of a legal
mm, mm,
representation to challenge my detainment.
mm.
It was very unclear, sort of like on what grounds am I being held there exactly? What exactly is my crime? But anyways, so I'm meeting with the U.S. consul. I find out that the White House knows about it. They've been in touch with my brother. People know about this. They were very explicit that the U.S. did not want Israel to find out about it. Because if Israel found out about it, then
Right.
I would become a bargaining chip. They didn't
Mm,
want that to happen. They did explicitly say we don't want President Trump to find out about it. So I think that this was kind of like a warning to the Lebanese. The
mm,
Lebanese were in
mm,
the room, which was kind of like you don't want to make this worse for yourselves. Now, what also was happening at the same time is President Trump was going to be landing in Riyadh a few
okay, so
days
it was then.
later and
Mm,
meeting in Saudi Arabia with the Lebanese president.
wow.
So I think politically it was very sensitive, and at the same time, Idan Alexander was released while I was detained. So there were also sensitivities, Steve
Mm,
Witkoff
mm,
helped negotiate that. Um, now to have to deal with another, I mean, not the same situation, but to now have to deal with another American being held in another, in a neighboring Arab country it wouldn't be a good look for Lebanon.
mm, mm,
Um, from that moment, basically, I used that meeting to at least try to gain some concessions. So, for example, I said, I've been in handcuffs for days. I'm even sleeping in handcuffs. So the U.S. consul said to the Lebanese, does he really need to be in handcuffs all the time? And from that moment on, I didn't have to wear handcuffs again until I was released, which I'm happy to tell you about what that experience was like. The U.S. Embassy had a piece of paper in their hands, which was a list of lawyers. It was in English, a list of
mm,
lawyers
mm,
in Lebanon, which they were going to give me, and they never gave me. And, to this day, I will never understand why I was not afforded a lawyer, given that I was essentially disappeared.
mm.
Um, and, again, without an arrest warrant, I have no paperwork to sort of prove what happened. But then after that, the consul said this is all I've been working on for days. So again, 3 days into it, I realized that this kind of was a big deal on the outside, but I
Mm,
had no
mm,
idea. And then in the meantime, the daily interrogations continued. Um, they didn't torture me, but they tortured prisoners around me. So there was one prisoner I remember they took him out of a room where they held all of us. Um, they put a bag over his head. They took him to an adjacent room, and then they were firing at his head,
oh,
playing Russian roulette, where they say, I think it's where they say we have one bullet in
mm,
this
mm,
gun.
mm,
Every time they would shoot, he would scream. I heard slapping. Um, I saw how they held the other prisoners. I mean, I was of course treated much better as an American, but I saw how other prisoners were treated, the conditions that they were in. There were two other foreign prisoners that I was with, who were the only ones who I actually had any kind of
Mm,
communication
mm.
with. One was a Syrian with German citizenship. He was 4 days into his detention, and they did not allow him to speak to the German embassy, which, again, my understanding is under international law, they do
It's
have to
illegal.
provide consular access. And he wasn't being treated like a foreigner. They were treating him, I think, I mean, I would assume he was Palestinian Syrian. They were treating him like a local Arab, treating him horribly. He was in a cell with, he said, with common criminals, murderers, etc. And then another was a well-known sports, I'll just say sports figure to protect his identity,
Mm.
who also had a foreign passport because he was born elsewhere and came back to Lebanon with his family. And he told me that if they kept him in prison, he was going to kill himself. So
Oh
I
my
was
word.
listening to people being tortured. I was with
Oh
other
my word.
prisoners who were very despondent. Eventually, my condition, they eventually they allowed me to sleep in an office. So they would lock an office at night. It was kind of like an interrogation room, and I
Mm,
was able to
mm.
sleep there. And the big thing was I had access to TV. So I was watching the news. So again, I watched Idan Alexander get released on
Amazing.
TV. I watched Trump
So
land in
interesting.
Riyadh all while
Mm.
I was in detention. Um, uh, Basically 6 days, on the sixth day, a judge who I never got to meet or like, represent myself in front of, ordered me released. I was blindfolded and handcuffed. I was taken by armed soldiers to the Beirut airport, and I boarded a flight to London. Um, and as hard as it was, 6 days of no showering, no freedom, I mean, horrible experience. I think what was even harder was the aftermath of it and dealing with people's responses to it. I found that, when all of this was happening to me, I guess what kind of kept me going is I promised myself that I'm not gonna let them get away with this. I am gonna tell my story. I'm gonna make sure that this is known when I'm out.
Mm, mm.
What I found when I got out was some people blamed me. Not many, but there were people who blamed me, which was very hurtful. I left with PTSD, and
Of
some people
course.
really were unable to express any sympathy. But I also found that especially the U.S. media, the mainstream U.S. media, was not interested in telling my story. And for me, that was very, very hurtful because they've invested so much time reporting on Mahmoud Khalil, on other international activists in the US who have been detained by ICE. And I'm not saying that their story shouldn't be told, but why should it be an either or? And
And
what I found was that there was zero interest.
yeah, and why? Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think several reasons. I think that my story doesn't fit into a clear narrative, and it goes
Mm,
back to why I actually am quite distrustful of the mainstream
yeah.
media. It doesn't fit into a clear narrative. As far as I am aware, I am the only Jewish Israeli dual national who served in the Israeli army who's been detained like this. There was the case of Daniel Sharon in the early 2000s. He was a dual Israeli German national.
Mm,
It was a big story. He was arrested in
mm,
Lebanon. He didn't do army service. There was another case in October of last year of Joshua Tertatovsky, a British Israeli American also didn't do army service. So what made my case also complex was my army
mm,
service.
mm.
So I was an American Jew with Israeli citizenship who had done Israeli army service, who was detained at the time when Trump was in the Middle East, and literally no US outlet was willing to even help me tell my story. And it really made me feel like my life was worth less than these international student activists, and I didn't understand why they prioritized telling stories of foreign nationals over American
Makes no
citizens.
sense.
So for me, what I decided to do at that point was I said, you know what? I was getting so depressed because I felt like what happened to me was for nothing and no one cared. And maybe even the fact that they weren't willing to even help me tell my story was because they thought I deserved it. So I decided to just go on social media Because again, this is the beauty of social media and the era
Yeah.
we're living in, is that we don't need as many gatekeepers and
Hmm.
to just tell my own story. And shortly after I did that, it was actually the South African Jewish Report reached out to me, and that was the first outlet that was willing to tell my help me tell my story in a more formal media sense. And then after that, the London Jewish Chronicle. And then eventually, this is maybe 2 months later, then in Israel now, it's got national news in Israel. But the point is that why is it only Jewish outlets or Israeli media
I was going
that
to
should be
say,
telling
so
the
far,
story? I'm an American.
Yeah. So far, you're just talking about Jewish media, which is a complete absurdity. It's filtering because it just doesn't tell the stories that of how some other countries are behaving. It's just remarkable.
It's shocking. And so, I mean, for me, it was shocking. So there was recovering from that and realizing that the mainstream media would never be interested in
Mm,
telling what happened to me. So one thing that so social media helped. At least some Jewish outlets, Israeli outlets, were willing to tell my story. And then the third thing is, I said there has to be some type of legal recourse
mm,
because Lebanon. So I'm completing now my master's at the London School of Economics in immigration policy, and one of my professors is he's a very well-known human rights lawyer. He's worked for the United Nations. I had a call with him after my detainment, and he said, no, Lebanon broke international law. You should have been afforded a lawyer. This was arbitrary
mm,
detention. The
mm.
conditions you were held in was cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, he said there are so many conventions that Lebanon broke here, you have recourse. So I'm actually now working with, and this is the first time I've, said it openly in the media. And I know Brooke Goldstein was recently
Mm.
in South Africa from the Lawfare Project. So I'm actually working with the Lawfare Project.
Brilliant.
They've been amazing to work with.
Right.
And I'm actually filing a complaint, a submission at the UN Working Group on
That's
Arbitrary
brilliant.
Detention against Lebanon. Because I want answers about what happened to me. I want to understand why didn't I see an arrest warrant? Why didn't I have a lawyer? Why wasn't I allowed to shower for 6 days? Why was I deprived of food sometimes? Why were people allowed to be tortured? I really want Lebanon to be held accountable. And at least for myself, I want some answers. So we're finalizing the submission. We've been working on it for the past month. But it's very painful for me that
I
my
can,
own country, I mean,
I
I
can,
belong to several countries, but the fact that the United States
Yeah.
and the mainstream media there sees what happened to me is not even newsworthy, not even worth mentioning. But I'm constantly reading about other people being detained by ICE. It's very, very painful for me.
It's absolutely incredible. Are you getting, I'm hoping that you're at least getting help from therapy, from dealing with the post-traumatic stress of this, because this is life altering potentially, if you don't deal with it, surely.
Yeah, I mean, of course, and it's going to take time. I mean, I have
Mm,
flashbacks to my detention every day, and again, I know that my conditions were much better. My conditions were much better than some of the other people I was held with. But again, what was very scary for me is that, you know, Israel is at war with Lebanon, and the department I was held by was controlled up
mm,
until 2023 by Hezbollah. And my understanding is, according to the Lebanese constitution, this government department has to be run by a Shia Muslim. And it was very, very scary because I was probably the only Israeli being held in Lebanon at a time of war and not knowing, if someone wanted to assassinate me, I mean, I wasn't being protected at all times. It could have happened.
mm, mm,
But I have flashbacks every day to it. On the other
right.
hand, what's also really surprised me is how resilient humans are. So, when I got out, I went back to London. I had my final exams. I now just finished my dissertation. So I've
Incredible.
kept busy.
Incredible.
I'm I'm functioning, I'm sleeping. And again, I think also what's been really difficult is there are some people, as I mentioned, who really blame me for what
Yeah,
happened.
can we just go back to that? Because what does that even mean? I blamed you for what?
Well, some people say, first of all, you asked for it. What did you expect would happen? You knew that it was dangerous. And I mean, again, I'm happy to discuss that. Of course, I knew that there was a risk traveling with my profile to the countries that
Mm-hmm.
I've traveled to. Of course. Um, However, I wasn't there just to have fun, so to speak. I really do view myself as a citizen journalist. I actually am now I'm going to be getting my license as a journalist, so I will officially have that on paper.
Right.
But no, I went with journalistic intent. And when journalists go to difficult regions, there always is a risk that something can happen. And that is what happened to me. I had been to Lebanon several times before, as recently as 1 week prior, with absolutely no issue.
Mm.
So
I don't think that
rationally,
I
there
don't think
was no reason to suspect that all in the span of a week that would change.
I don't think you need to be explaining this. I think it reminds me of many years ago in South Africa when hijackings were a thing. People would say, what were they driving? And you'd say, a BMW. Oh, well, it serves them right. Why would they drive a BMW when it's a hijackable car? I'm just using that as an example. I think we distance ourselves from it. We make ourselves feel a little bit better about the world when we can say, well, you shouldn't have gone there. You were looking for it. It wasn't responsible because it kind of just protects ourselves a little bit. So yeah, I think don't even to justify it. I think is to actually feed it, and I don't think you should. So, is it rude to ask you if you were rating the Lebanese prison on Booking.com, what kind of rating you'd give it?
Was it night one when I was in a real prison cell or when I was locked in an office? I mean, again,
you got an
the hot,
upgrade.
I would
You got
say
an
that
upgrade.
I got an upgrade.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the higher profile, I knew that the Lebanese knew that the
Mm,
longer they held me, the worse it was going to be for them. And again, I mean, I remember watching Trump land in Riyadh and just thinking to myself, like, does he know? Or who close to him knows that I'm here?
Over here.
Um, wh- but yeah, I don't let this define me. So in terms
mm,
of, traveling, reporting, okay, so there's certain risks I probably won't take, moving forward. First of all, I'm completely exposed after what happened because I went out into the public. I told
mm,
my
mm,
story. I'm
mm.
very exposed. But also there's a new movement to dox people who have served in the Israeli
Yeah,
army.
I've seen
So
it.
actually in Canada, there's a website called Find an IDF Soldier. And this is a complete coincidence. Several days after I was released from Lebanon, I appeared on that site. It
Mm,
has my photo, it has personal details about me. There are people who sit in different countries and research every person in that country who has served in the IDF and then try to expose those people so they can get doxxed and canceled. So forget even what happened in
mm,
Lebanon because of
mm,
this growing movement to turn Israelis into
mm,
pariahs. I'm out there on the internet. There's
mm,
certain risks I won't take. I know that in South Africa, there have also been stories of,
mm,
trying to expose South Africans who have served in the IDF. Um, so yeah, there's certain risks I won't take in majority Muslim countries, but I'm not going to let what happened to me define me. I'm going to continue to travel. I'm going to continue to report on all types of regions in the world. What I always tell people is that, I've lived 20 years abroad. I've 100 countries. This was the first really bad thing that
mm,
happened. I
mm.
have had some close calls, but this was really like the worst thing. And it could have been a lot worse than it was. And my essence is to tell stories and to see things that people otherwise wouldn't know about. So, I mean, right now, I mean, this is just a small thing. Right now, I'm in Quebec City. And I'm going to be meeting the Jewish community in Quebec City, which most people don't even know exists.
I was
It's
going to say,
300.
I wasn't even sure there was a Jewish community there, so thank you for that.
Most people don't even know that
Yeah,
there is.
yeah.
It's a very, very French
Mm.
environment. It's a very Catholic environment. What is it like to be Jewish? They don't have a rabbi here. So I'm going to be next week in Quito, Ecuador, and Lima, Peru.
Amazing.
I'm going to be exploring all types of things when
That
I'm
is
in those
brilliant.
countries.
That is brilliant.
The Jewish community is included. But yeah, no, I don't think that anything is really going to change for me other than certain risks that I'm not necessarily,
Mm.
I'm probably not going to take in majority Muslim countries. The good news is that I've seen the majority of the Muslim world already, and there's still so much of the world to explore. So the travel doesn't have to stop.
Dan Brotman, that is just, it's actually mind blowing. I can't get over the story that you've told and some of the stories that you've told. And I just want to thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you for taking us on that journey, because it's just absolutely astounding and mind blowing. And it just talks about so many things. It talks about identity, it talks about press, it talks about media, it talks about the role that we have, the responsibility we have. It talks about how we react to people when they've experienced something. So certainly it's a huge amount for me to think about. What I love most is that you are continuing on your journey. You're not letting it stop you. And I think that is inspiring and brilliant. And I have no doubt that there will be some moments along the way where you have a wobble or two, but just keep doing what you're doing and keep inspiring people the way you certainly have inspired me, and no doubt everybody else when they have access to this podcast. That is where we leave it. I've been talking to Dan Brotman as he shares his incredible story. Leave your comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm Howard Feldman. Imagine if I was sensitive.